Hello everyone, I'm Shubh and welcome back to my channel F1 Aerodynamicist. This video, I'd like to start by saying a big thank you for all the love and support that you guys have shown me over the CFD type and the aero analysis type of videos that I've been coming out with. It's wonderful to see people join this conversation and add on to the conversation so that we can all learn and know a bit more about some of the aero mechanisms that goes on in F1 cars, right? Well, where have I been for the last 1 month? I've been developing a basics aerodynamic course, that is an F1 Aerodynamics 101 course in the background, so that a lot more people can join this conversation and a lot more people can be educated. But I had to take a break, in the sense I said there's a lot of noise going on about the DRS effectiveness of the Red Bull, and we need to understand a bit more so that we can join this conversation in a more educated manner. So this video is dedicated to understanding how the DRS affects the rear wing, the beam wing, and also the rear tires that apparently nobody's talking about. We will also try and answer the question of, is triple DRS a thing that Gary Anderson has put out? And I will give my own perspective after going into the basics to what I think is really going on. So without wasting too much time, let's dive into it then. Well, the RB19 is an absolute monster and an absolute jet on the straights, with around 20, 25, 35 kilometers of an hour speed advantage with DRS open with all of its realistic competitors. And that is huge because all its competitors are just sitting ducks on the straights, right? And this has given the team massive cushion to any mistakes they make in qualifying or any issues that they might have with the car. So what is it that makes this car so efficient? Well, in my personal opinion, it's aero efficiency and that amazing floor which produces a lot of efficient downforce. But why take my word for it when we can try and understand what's going on? So let's first get into the basics of DRS, and then let's try and evaluate the effect of DRS on each of the components that are around it. So let's first get into the DRS basics. Well, the rear half of the car, which in our discussion primarily involves the rear wing, the beam wing, and the diffuser, works together to generate rear downforce. They are not dependent on each other, but are complementary to each other. And this is very important because a lot of the media have been saying that they're dependent on each other, but rather they are complementary to each other. What do I mean by this? For example, the beam wing allows more vertical expansion from the diffuser without actually increasing the size of the diffuser, because the size of the diffuser is governed and limited by regulations. And it does it by its upwashing characteristics. So both the parts can work perfectly by themselves, but work together better. The rear half of the car, which also includes the rear tires, contributes to the highest percentage to the total amount of drag that is generated by the car. In simple words, if you want to make your car efficient, this is where you get the most gains. This is why teams come up with a rear wing and a beam wing package where speed sensitivity is high, for example, Saudi and Monza. And here's the cool thing, Red Bull were the only team who actually got a proper update package and was not like a trim package that everybody else got. They had a dedicated main plane, a flap, and a beam wing, which was a single element beam wing, as you can see from these figures here, right, that they brought to Saudi. So Red Bull were way more prepared compared to every other team that was there on the grid when it came to Saudi to kind of present and take the opportunities of the speed sensitivity that the track offers. So let us talk a little bit more about the drag, right? Within the rear part of the car, the biggest contributors to drag are the rear wheels, the rear wing, the beam wing. The drag from the rear wheels is mostly due to the pressure between the front and the rear half of the tire, while the beam wing and the rear wing have two components of drag to it. One is the induced drag, which is the drag due to downforce itself, and the pressure drag, which is drag literally due to the resistance or the area that the surfaces offer. Now the floor is probably the most efficient downforce producing device on the entire car. So there's not much to be gained there in terms of drag reduction as compared to the beam wing, the rear tires and the rear wing. So we will focus our discussion on these three, but we'll also show you how the floor can affect the components around it when we start talking about tires, right? But before we dive into this discussion, let me just give you the ABCs of this simulation. So this simulation is with a single element cranked up beam wing, which is pretty much on its limit, as Red Bull came up with something like that at the Saudi Grand Prix. And it has a DRS on and a DRS off simulation, where this is DRS off and this is DRS on. So let us first look onto the effect of DRS onto the rear wing. So let us look at the effect of the DRS on the rear wing. So when the DRS is open, the rear wing flap opens up and there are two effects. First, the rear wing flap produces very little downforce and in turn stops complementing the rear wing main plane in downforce generation. So what do I mean by this? Imagine you have a rear wing section, right? And you have airflow that's going up. Now, because of the presence of the flap is going to induce downwash, and that's going to locally increase the angle of attack of the rear wing main plane itself. And when the DRS is on, that is when this flap starts being a neutral section, literally, it stops doing that effect. So it primarily reduces the downforce that is being generated by the rear wing, and because induced drag is a function of downforce or lift, as we so say, because the downforce decreases, the drag also decreases. So that's quite simple. The second effect is the pressure drag, and you can clearly see this from the CP plots. So these are CP plots wherein anything that's red is high pressure, and you can see that because of the area itself, there's a lot of high pressure on the rear wing, and the moment the DRS is on, all that high pressure region goes away, which will result in decreasing pressure drag. So that is how the rear wing flap affects both the induced drag and the pressure drag. You can also see the change in angle of attack through this image here. The top case is the DRS off case, and you can see the amount of upwash and the associated downwash in front of the rear wing, which results in an increase in angle of attack. And the moment DRS is open, the upwash is reduced, so this is much more flatter, and this is not as deeper, so the angle of attack of the rear wing itself also decreases. So that is how the DRS affects the rear wing. Now let's look into how the DRS affects the beam wing, and things start getting really interesting now. So to try and understand the effect of DRS on beam wing, we need to take our discussion of the effect of DRS on the rear wing a step further. What do I mean by this? So we've established that with DRS off, you have a lot of upwash that is coming from the entire rear wing, and the rear wing flap lands up creating downwash, which lands up increasing the angle of attack of the rear wing main plane, right? So what does this circulation land up doing to the beam wing? Well, it controls the angle of attack of the beam wing. So for some of you guys who don't know, it's a very simple relation. You have the lift coefficient versus the angle of attack, and at some point you land up stalling the entire system. And if, for example, your beam wing is already working on its limit, like for example, it is here, if you increase the angle of attack in a pseudo sense by putting the DRS on, you can push this into stall, technically speaking. And let us try and see if that's happening. So you can see that because of the reduction in upwash, and this is really cool, when the DRS is open, the upwash reduces, and that lands up reducing the upwash that this beam wing element faces, which results in an increase in angle of attack, as you can see from the increased separation here compared to the image on top. However, this is a possible mechanism, but an unlikely mechanism, because how many times are you going to depend on the DRS to stall your rear wing? And just in terms of race pace, if your car is faster, you will barely get DRS for a couple of laps, right? So your overall race pace with having a single element stalling on the limit kind of beam wing would actually be slower than if you just had a beam wing which worked efficiently. So while this mechanism is possible, I think it's not really realistic or probable in a sense where an F1 car has to go through so many car attitudes and so many pitch, yaw, roll angles, and there are so many variables at play that can easily influence this entire ecosystem. And normally stable ecosystems are good ecosystems. You can see that the Red Bull has a stable rear platform which is really allowing them to extract the maximum from their floor and their diffuser. And I think that's the real key rather than some trickery around the beam wing that's going on. What's also cool to see is the leading edge separation bubble, which is a really cool feature of when the DRS is open, which I've read in some of the research papers is what leads to the flutter characteristics that we've seen on so many teams. You know, when the DRS wing starts fluttering, a lot of researchers pointed out that it is mainly because of the way teams treat this leading edge separation bubble. So cool features that you can see. Let me know if something that I've missed that you can see in the comments for this slide. Another cool thing to see is how the span-wise flow changes when the DRS is on. So you can see that I've marked here when the DRS is off, this beam wing is already on the limit, and you can see that it's pretty much not very attached in a lot of regions because of, you know, the poor energy flow that comes to the rear end of the car. And that's why you'll also see teams kind of use variable chord to try and make sure that there's not a lot of losses as there are in this simulation. But you know, at the end of the day, we are looking at relative differences, and that's what is really important to us. So we can still try and use this to understand and determine some patterns. So the moment DRS is on, you can see that that region of attached flow shrinks down to a much smaller region, which indicates that there is a potential to kind of stall parts of the beam wing. But again, in my own opinion, I don't think it's an efficient way of doing things. We might be useful for you on the straights, but when it comes to pure lap time, pure race time, it might be a sucker. Now let us look at the rear tires that no one's really talking about on the internet. And this is something that you'd pick up on if you've had experience in F1 or if you have the access to a simulation and if you have the vision to see it. But I don't really look at numbers, but when the numbers for the simulations came out, it was quite evident that the rear tire drag reduction played a huge role in the overall drag reduction of the entire system. So why is this really happening and how is the floor connected to all of this? Let's try and understand this. Now let us try and understand how this DRS would affect the tires. So this is the DRS off case and this is the DRS on case, right? And the drag from the tires is actually quite simple. Like if you take a very simple model, you have a high pressure in front and you have a low pressure behind, and the higher this pressure difference, the higher the drag. Like so the greater the delta P, the greater the drag, right? So in some way, if you could have a situation where there's positive pressure here and there is less negative pressure here, then the pressure difference around the faces of the tire would decrease and the drag associated to the rear tires would decrease. And that is exactly what happened. And you can see the back face of the rear tires, how much low pressure region there are in this case. And in this case, it's slightly higher pressure-ish, which is what results to the decrease in the drag from the rear tires. But why is this happening in the first place? And the answer is quite simple. Because when the DRS is off, the entire rear wing, beam wing, and the floor is working as an ecosystem, and you would land up getting more flow expansion, right? And that flow expansion would also support more attachment around the rear tires. But the moment the DRS is put on, and let's say the beam wing stops supporting the floor, then suddenly you have much less expansion from the diffuser itself because the beam wing is not supporting the diffuser in its expansion, right? And because of that, there is a lot less turning that happens around the rear tire, and thus there is slightly higher pressure on the rear face of the tire, which is basically this case that we were referring to, which results in a reduction of drag further on the overall car. So I hope you've seen the potential of how the DRS can affect the rear wing, the beam wing, and the rear tires. Is the triple DRS a thing? As I said earlier, don't believe so, because I think you would have to really make the beam wing work on the edge. And just in terms of the variables that are involved in Formula One, I don't think it's worth it, because also cranking up a single element beam wing that way can be quite draggy in its own right to begin with. So it might lead to a lesser race time. But hey, CFD shows that there is a possibility of this happening. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video and learned a little bit of basics about how the DRS affects everything, so you can come up with your own educated guess or your own educated perspective into this conversation, and let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thank you for watching and do subscribe. You are watching F1 Aerodynamicist.